Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Navigating History podcast and our inaugural season on Alexander the Great. This episode is going to be covering the Battle of Gaugamela, which is the primary military conflict that followed directly from the Battle of Issus. And this battle can really be summed up in 5 words. Persians learn, but still lose. Because, as you'll see throughout this episode, everything that happens throughout the lead up to this battle, and even in the battle itself, the Persians sort of learned from everything that had happened at the Battle of the Granicus River and the Battle of Issus, but they unfortunately weren't able to. They still didn't win. Alexander's tactical, and strategic mind won out, and the way that this battle unfolded really solidifies Alexander as one of the great military commanders of not just antiquity but pretty much of all time. Throughout all of history that we've studied, because as I mentioned in the first episode of this season, the Battle of Granicus, Alexander was very much not who he, very much was not as tactically, he wasn't very tactically sophisticated, but by this point he's, not only is he a few years older than he was, obviously, when this happened, and a little bit more experienced, but he's been on campaign, he's experienced what the ins and outs of battle are. So he knows, okay, this is going to work or this isn't. And he's much less rash, much more, I almost want to say Caesarian, even though Alexander comes before Caesar, but he's so focused on the little things, the details. He's so detailed in his planning, as you'll see later in this episode. He is so focused on every single aspect of his army and everything that they need to succeed. Now, the overall battle sort of begins pretty much directly following the Battle of Issus, where the Persian king Darius III, or Darius, as I've heard people tell me that I should pronounce it so, Darius III, he very much. He's, if you remember from last week, Darius left with his tail between his legs. He fled the battlefield at Issus under Alexander's pursuit, and he was very, he was humbled. And what do a lot of really strong, powerful people do when they feel humbled by another strong, powerful person? They strike out with bravado, which is exactly what Darius did in the letter that he sent to Alexander immediately after the Battle of Issus. In fact, one of the things I forgot to mention on last week's episode was that this was a significant battle for Alexander, not just because of it solidified his power, but because he captured Darius's wife and his daughters at the Battle of Issus. So Darius is obviously smarting from the battle, and he's lost his wife and his family, and instead of, he doesn't show any humility, and very much is focused on, I'm still the king of Persia, I'm still powerful, we still have the greater numbers, we're still, right? And he's not wrong that he does have power, and that he is a very powerful figure in this world, but he goes about this completely wrong from my perspective here. The first letter that he sends to Alexander, in fact, he sends 3 throughout the next few years leading up to the Battle of Gaugamela. But the first one is very much, hey, give me my people back, and also leave. And now you have a chance to, withdraw from Persia and leave, and sort of leave me alone. And never come back, kind of thing. Like, very much, get out of here and give me my stuff back. Very, again, filled with bravado and like force, and you will do what I say because I say it. Very much what a king would say to one of his subjects, or somebody who he considers lesser than. Although, and Alexander, of course, being Alexander, being somewhat of a, A, having A being high on confidence, and B, being very, like, focused himself, and being very, like, powerful in his own right, and thinking a lot of himself, doesn't even respond initially. Instead, just sort of continues along with his conquest in Persia, in Asia Minor. And one of the things that I mentioned last week, but sort of really happened after the Battle of Issus, was Alexander was able to, launch his campaign against the rest of the Persian Empire, right? He was very much, the rising power in Asia Minor at this point. And in fact, once he had gone, he had once he'd won at Issus, he had control over all of southern Asia, which is, big freaking deal. In fact, the next thing that Alexander did was he marched to the city of Tyre, and laid it to siege. There may be some of you thinking, oh, why aren't you covering this? Because it's technically a military engagement or whatever. But sieges, very little happens during a siege that is sort of worthy of note. It's sort of like, oh yeah, this dude laid siege to the thing, and then eventually he either won or left. That's how sieges work. It's, to me, there's a few sieges throughout history that are very interesting because but again, there are a few sieges throughout history that are very interesting because they have important details or character moments for historical figures, and things happen. Obviously, things happen, and it is important to mention, but it's not as decisive or as crucial as what happens, in the Battle of Gaugamela, in my opinion. But Alexander laid siege to the city of Tyre and eventually broke the siege after a few months. That's the other thing, is sieges take, months of time. He started the siege in January and it ended in July of 330. In July of 330 BC. And or 332 BC, my apologies. Eventually, and this gave Alexander, again, a very strong control. He gave him a lot of control over the Achaemenid Empire, and over the Persian Empire, and over Asia Minor as a whole. In fact, the next thing he did after capturing Tyre was to march into Egypt, and the Persian satrap in Egypt sort of surrendered to Alexander, claiming him to be the king, because they sort of realized, all right, we're not exactly super loyal to Darius and the Persians, but and we're realizing that Alexander is the rising power in this part of the world. He's on the ascendancy, and Darius is on the decline. And we think Alexander is going to be the person to go with going forward. So they sort of say, all right, yeah, we'll swear fealty to you. Cool. And they, rather than helping Darius and, bogging Alexander down in Egypt, they allow him to rest and resupply his army, and he's able to recuperate. He's been on campaign for, like I mentioned, he's been on campaign for quite a while at this point. His army is tired, they're stressed out. They're in a foreign land, and they're able to recuperate, regain some numbers, regain morale, and regain energy. And this is when, just after the capture of Tyre and the Alexander's on his way to Egypt, this is when Darius sends the second letter, which is a lot less confrontational than the first. Let's say he concedes territory. In fact, he offers one of his daughters in marriage and asks for the return of some of the prisoners, including his wife. And says, okay, all right, we'll split it. We'll split it. We'll you can have this territory, and I'll take what I have, and we'll sort of chill. sort of a peace. Suing for peace is a very important term here. But again, Alexander doesn't even respond. In fact, ignores it. And this is key. Alexander's lack of a response to either of the two letters sent by Darius or Darius is so critical, because it is what fuels Darius to start raising another military force. Not only does Darius feel like Alexander is, sort of walked into his homeland and taken it, which he has, but also he feels disrespected as from one, king to another. He feels disrespected by this. He feels as if his position is being, not taken seriously. And of course he's right. Alexander isn't taking his position seriously. He takes him seriously as a military commander, but not as a political figure, shall we say. He's sort of, in fact, after the third letter is sent, Alexander does respond. There's a third letter sent while Alexander is, sort of resupplying in Egypt, and he writes back saying, "There is only one king of Persia," as in that is himself. Alexander will be the only king of Persia. This is when Darius offers to split the empire in third. He offers to completely split the empire 50-50 in the third, in his third letter to Alexander. And Alexander finally responds and says, there is only one king of Persia. This again, that's a tasty little statement from history there. That's very, he's finally acknowledging that, this is happening, that Darius is sending him these letters of sort of trying to sort of reconcile the kingdom and sort of trying to sue for peace. And he basically says, there will be no peace. One of us is going to die. Either I'm going to win, or, I'm basically there can be only one. I don't know if anyone has ever, read or seen the Harry Potter movies, but it's kind of like, neither can live while the other survives, as in between Harry and Voldemort, there can be only one. That's kind of what this felt like. This is reaching its climax. And, Darius is now preparing openly for a military engagement with another military engagement with the Macedonians here. Again, after settling things in Egypt, Alexander returned to Tyre and then crossed was like sort of preparing to cross the Euphrates River and continue his campaign the following year. Alexander was preparing to march on Babylon, which is part of the Persian Empire at the time. And obviously Darius knows this. That's where Alexander needs to go, because that's where the rest of the empire is. It's kind of important. There's where, the Mesopotamia and Persia, the capitals, the major cities are. And, basically whoever holds those holds, whoever holds those holds the majority of the empire. Alexander's captured some major towns at this point, but those are the sort of the crown jewel, if you will. So Darius sets up his forces across the Euphrates River, sort of on a direct route from Egypt to Babylon, pretty much right along the bank of the Euphrates, saying like, all right, here's the direct route. And Alexander does something different here. As I mentioned in the first episode with Memnon of Rhodes, if you remember Memnon of Rhodes, kind of a legend, he was very much involved in the Battle of the Granicus River, and when Alexander first invaded, he suggested the scorched earth tactic, which would have worked, although the Persians turned him down. This time, Darius learns from his mistake, where he says, they didn't use scorched earth tactics before, but they do this time. But it's, unfortunately for them, it's in the wrong place. They think Alexander's going to take a straight route directly to Babylon to confront Darius, but in fact, Alexander, realizing that, Darius, where Darius is camped out, he realizes this, and in fact takes a northern route, which is a longer route, but it would allow for his army to collect supplies and forage, and the towns there are sort of left relatively undefended because Darius thinks that Alexander's going to take a different route. So in fact, the northern route, the northern route sort of threw them for a loop. In fact, Darius sent one of his trusted generals. I believe the way to pronounce it is Mazaeus. So I believe it's Mazaeus. I could be wrong on the pronunciation. And I apologize, by the way, if I get any of these pronunciations completely wrong. That I'm not great at pronunciations. But he sends Mazaeus to sort of slow Alexander down, and it doesn't work. Mazaeus kind of just retreats and then runs away and doesn't really do anything. And this is what alerts Alexander to where the Persians have set up, so that then he takes the north route, which throws the Persians off. So if we're analyzing the Persian strategy, it's actually a good strategy. Unfortunately, it just didn't work. A lot of ancient historians give the Persians a hard time for not harassing Alexander's army, but there wasn't much that they could do because they were sort of set up in a different spot, and they thought Alexander was going to go one way, and he ended up going another way. So, initially when I was doing my research for this episode, I was thinking, okay, why didn't they, do more to, sort of use guerrilla warfare tactics, set fire to the baggage train, disrupt the supply lines, disrupt the chain of command, disrupt the travel and make the Macedonians, put out a lot of guards and sort of tire them out, before actually engaging in a full-on military engagement. But upon doing further research, it was because they were going to, or they may have done, but unfortunately they took a different route. They took a northern route to Babylon and crossed the Euphrates at a different point, crossed the Euphrates River at a different point, which sort of threw the Persians into disarray, because they didn't know where Alexander was. Basically, they didn't know where they knew that he had gone north, but they didn't want to send their entire force north and get into small groups searching for him, because then they could get picked off in smaller numbers. So they actually they didn't really do what they wanted. Things didn't go the way they wanted, for sure. So in fact, Darius, sort of once he learned that Alexander went north, he knew that he would be marching towards Babylon. And in fact, he was very proactive. And there are a lot of historical sources that give sort of Darius and the Persians a bad reputation and bad name, especially at the end here in the Battle of Gaugamela. But I don't think that's necessarily true, or fair, to be honest. He tried. He learned. They did learn. Persians learn, but still lose. But they really, really, really tried. They tried to do everything correctly. They tried to, they had the greater numbers. They tried to sort of delay the battle. They would have possibly harassed Alexander's army in that way. They would have possibly sort of done things differently and made things harder on the Macedonians' advance. But it didn't really work. In fact, Darius, even with his chosen location for battle, picked the perfect location for himself. He chose a wide open plain near the town of Gaugamela. So he didn't want to repeat what had happened at the Battle of Issus, where they had been cramped in, and Alexander's superior. The fact that Alexander had the smaller number in terms of force didn't really matter. Whereas here, he wanted to be able to take advantage of the Battle of Gaugamela. He wanted to be able to take advantage of his superior numbers. And in fact, he, by all intents and purposes, he did everything he could to try and win this battle. And unfortunately, he just lost. Up until a certain point, he did everything that he was supposed to do. In fact, my personal opinion is, if things had gone differently for the Persians, if things had gone slightly differently for the Persians, then the entire battle could have changed. And again, this is why I love history, because, if Alexander doesn't take that northern route on a whim, pretty much on a whim, going, all right, well, I'll take a northern route because I think it'll be better. You know, sort of like, again, if Alexander was, if things had gone slightly differently, then the Persians would have definitely done a lot of damage to the Macedonian here at Gaugamela, for sure. Again, so if we're going to the setup to the battle, over the last few days of September, Alexander's sort of, lumbering into place in, he's sort of moving, campaigning and moving towards where he knows knows where the Persians are camped. Again, he captured a few Persian scouts at one point on his campaign, on his route. So he knows roughly where they are. So he's coming down from the north, but by this point the Persians know that Alexander's coming from the north, and they set up near the town of Gaugamela, again on that really wide open field. And Darius has ordered all of the, underbrush and trees and everything cleared from that field, just to make it 100%, 100% easier for his forces to just handle things. Better for his superior numbers and his superior cavalry as well. Just making sure that they sort of have every advantage they could possibly have. He even sends, there's a hill, about a few kilometers from where the Persians are camped outside of the town of Gaugamela. And he sends a detachment of cavalry under Mazaeus, again, the guy who had fled Alexander previously, whose scouts had been captured and who had, had conflict with Alexander previously. He sends him to go take this hill. Mazaeus takes the hill, and then when the Macedonians show up, he sort of just flees. He just runs away. And again, this is what I'm talking about, where this isn't Darius' fault that this battle didn't go to plan for him, because, had Mazaeus, sort of not necessarily been able to hold off on the hill, because it was a small hill that was easily defensible. It was a really good defensive position. If they'd been able to hold off on the hill, they could have, sort of waylaid the Macedonian forces. They could have, had the Macedonian forces taken an unadvantageous position. Mazaeus, and I guess Darius as well, didn't really see the hill as such a strategical advantage. Although personally, I think, the high ground is always important. To quote Obi-Wan, I have the high ground, and he sort of wins in Star Wars there. But the high ground in battles is so key, because then it's such an easily defensible position. And it allows you to sort of see everything that's going on around you. And, if Mazaeus hadn't vacated the hill the way he did at the start of the battle, he would have been able to sort of send parties down the hill, traveling at speed, especially with cavalry, down the hill, traveling at speed towards the Macedonian army. And they would have been able to, harass them and then charge. And if the Macedonians wanted to take the hill, they would have had to, charge up the hill against a fortified defensive position, which, if you know anything at all about military history, is a bad idea in a bad time. You're just going to lose, and basically you're just throwing human lives at the problem, and it's not going to go anywhere. But unfortunately, as it goes, Mazaeus vacated the hill. Alexander takes the hill because he realizes, hey, this is very, very, very important. And, because of this, this throws the Babylonian, or the Persians into Persians who are in Babylon at this time, into a very unfortunate sort of bad position, more so than just, okay, well, Alexander now has the high ground. They have to be ready for an attack at all times here, even though they have the superior numbers, even though they have like all of the advantages in terms of numbers and training and skill and everything. They have to always be ready for battle. And Alexander knows this. In fact, he learns from what happened at the Battle of the Granicus River, where they'd been marching all day and then charged up the river. And, again, his horses were tired by that point, so it nearly cost them the battle. Whereas at the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander takes the hill, takes a few days, his army rests, while the Persians are constantly on alert, they're constantly fighting, they're stressed out, they're, everything's going bad for them. They're stressed out, they're anxious, they don't know when a Macedonian attack is going to come, but they know that one is going to come. They don't know which side of the hill they're coming out of, but it's a really bad time for them, even though they have the superior numbers. And Darius does a good job of sort of using that numerical advantage, sort of resting his troops when he can. But still, there's this uneasiness in the Persian camp created by the fact that Mazaeus vacated the hill and didn't put up a fight even when taking that hill. So Alexander takes a few days and sort of rests his army. So everyone is just, it's obviously you're going into battle, so it's as light as it can be, but it's a more relaxed time, in fact, and he doesn't emerge until October 1st of 331 BCE, where he's sort of deliberating with his generals the night before. Parmenion suggests a night attack. Alexander's like, no, we'll attack in the day. So all right, fine, we'll attack tomorrow morning. Give the troops and one more night of rest, and then we'll attack in the morning. And for just a second, I want to take a side note here and talk about Parmenion. Parmenion is sort of, in my opinion, at least throughout my study of history, has been overlooked a lot when discussing Alexander the Great. Parmenion, on his own, was one of the great generals of his time. He, now 3 times in combat, plus at the sieges that we've previously mentioned, he holds his own against a superior force and somehow still ends up, winning. And he's always giving this prudent advice, at least throughout history. He's always suggesting good tactics to Alexander, regardless of whether or not Alexander takes his advice. And in fact, I feel like Parmenion has a little bit of an issue where his role is sort of capped off as like, okay, he's Alexander's second in command, yes, but he's also, he's sort of like, he's a great commander in his own right, and probably would have defeated the Persians on his own as well, regardless of whether or not Alexander was even there. Anyway, that's just my Parmenion fanboy corner. But again, back to what happens at the Battle of Gaugamela. So October 1st, the Persians have been deployed for battle since the night before, because of course they had to be, because they had been for days at this point, knowing that Alexander's on that hill. Alexander sort of, I don't know if this was done on purpose, or if he's just, like every other young person in their 20s and sometimes oversleeps. Trust me, I know, as one, I sometimes do. But he oversleeps, and they set up for battle around noon on October 1st, 331. And the way that they're set up is, obviously, Darius sets up with cavalry, his cavalry on the wings, his infantry, including himself, directly in the center, directly in the Persian center, with his immortals and Greek mercenaries, and his heavy infantry and his light infantry are all there in the middle, which is traditional for the Persians and has served them well. And his cavalry on the wings, and he actually had Indian chariots that had accompanied him. He had chariots that were there, and he had, like I mentioned earlier, he had the ground around Gaugamela cleared so that it would be more advantageous for the chariots to fight. They were set up in front of the infantry, sort of screening them and offering mobile sort of support wherever needed. So again, he's deployed in a smart sort of fashion. His cavalry's on the wings, he's in the center, so he's got 3 commanders, him, and then the 2 cavalry commanders, including Mazaeus, who, personally I'm not a huge fan of, but that's just me. Apparently Darius seemed to love this guy for some reason. But he put him in charge of the cavalry on one flank, and the other flank, and Darius in the middle. Alexander sets up in sort of a weird formation. And before I get to that, I want to talk about just how drastically outnumbered the Macedonians were. Again, they had about 47,000, 50,000 men, and the Persians had close to 100,000, if not over 100,000 men at this point. They had the vastly superior force, and part of the reason that Darius chose this battlefield was because he didn't want, again, like I said, he didn't want this this force to be sort of bottlenecked down. He wanted to use his superior numbers to his advantage and have as much of a wide open plain for them as possible. Again, good plan. Alexander sort of realizes this and sets up in a very peculiar fashion here. He set up on an angle so that, and with his cavalry on the wings and his infantry in the center. His infantry was in two lines, and his cavalry was staggered backwards. Their units were staggered backwards on both sides to prevent them from being flanked or encircled. And then they were reinforced with a little bit of infantry on the side. Sort of so that Alexander's right flank, the Macedonian right, was facing the Persian center. So his cavalry was charging directly, if they were to charge, would charge directly into the Persian infantry, again, down a hill. So this is, again, so they'd been able to gain that momentum. The battle kicked off with Darius sending his chariots forward, sending those chariots forward to sort of harass the Macedonian the Sarissa phalanx, which was directly the center of Alexander's line. That really extremely disciplined, amazing phalanx that we've discussed previously, right there in the center. Chariots would have been good to harass them, especially because they had, javelins and ranged weapons, and other ranged weapons. But, Alexander orders them to split so that the chariots ride into the Macedonian ranks and then are swallowed up by the Macedonians. Again, Darius ordering the chariots to charge or to advance, probably a good move. You've got the superior mobility, use it against a solid mass of humanity. You've got ranged weapons, use them. Smart move. Alexander counters with an even smarter move. And this is where this battle, the Battle of Gaugamela, for me, is where you really see Alexander's sort of reputation as a tactician sort of skyrocket. Because before he was good and, his army were good and, things sort of went in his favor occasionally on the battlefield, especially at the Granicus River. But here, everything is against him except for this hill, except for the fact that he had this hill, and he still sort of comes out with really, really smart ways of handling things. So the chariots are swallowed up, so they're basically neutralized and dealt with relatively quickly. And then Darius orders his cavalry to charge, and they charge Parmenion on the Macedonian left, and Parmenions overwhelmed and forced to give ground, but he still holds. They're giving some ground, but he's still holding, so they don't completely cave, and they're not overrun. And then, again, Alexander began moving his line to the right. He was always shifting his line right. So, again, Darius counters by moving his cavalry over to the left to, again, and sort of try and encircle them. Again, smart tactic, kind of a decent move. Sort of very, all right, he's thinking. He's it's punch, counter punch here. And this actually leaves his center open. Unfortunately, Darius then launches his cavalry forward. So both flanks are now engaged with cavalry, but not all of Alexander's cavalry have shifted to that Macedonian right flank. So some of his cavalry are engaged, and they're going to be overwhelmed. They're going to be slightly overwhelmed. Again, Alexander's, I don't know what his exact plan was going into this battle, but at the moment, some of Alexander's cavalry on both sides of the battle, so both the Macedonian left and the Macedonian right, are going to be overwhelmed at this point. So not good. But This is something that I believe he planned for based on what he does next. The next thing that he did was he aimed, like I said, he'd aimed his sort of this center right of his army directly at the, or sorry, he'd aimed the right flank of his army pretty much directly at the Persian center. And once Darius left his center undefended with any sort of mobile unit other than his infantry, Alexander charged. And this is where he won the battle. Darius sort of overconfidently thought, I can overrun them with cavalry and we can outflank them and we can crush them and sort of encircle them. Which, again, good plan, but he does it impulsively. He orders the cavalry to charge. It's an impulsive single moment where he goes, I'm going to make a decision and we're going to win. And he thinks he has an opportunity to win. And but if he's just a little bit more patient, he probably would have won. But in this case, Alexander has planned for this and immediately charges with his companion cavalry, so himself. He charges and smashes into the Persian center and lays waste to it and genuinely, completely, destroys it, and basically wipes them out. And Darius is again forced to flee. Unfortunately, he's again forced to flee. Alexander pursues him for a bit, but then his discipline holds, and he realizes, okay, I've got to get back to, Parmenion, and he comes back and circles back and saves Parmenion. And what had happened was Alexander had planned for the gap in his forces between, that little bit of cavalry that was cut off when on his right flank when the cavalry was engaged on the right and the center. There was a gap between the infantry at the center and the cavalry on the right, and Darius thought he could exploit this, right? He impulsively thought, okay, I'm going to charge, I can exploit this, and it didn't work. Alexander had planned for this and in fact ended up engaging Darius' forces and completely overwhelming them. And this whole battle, again, is so critical because this really cemented Alexander as the king of Persia. He had with the defeat here at the Gaugamela. I know Darius technically escapes, so the war was not over, but Alexander had complete control over most of the Persian Empire, including the city of Persia and also the city of Mesopotamia as well, and he controlled all of the major parts of the empire by this point, and his reputation had again grown. Right, the biggest thing for Alexander, and we'll see going forward with the rest of this season, not just against the Persians, but throughout all of his military campaigns, was his reputation as a commander. And again, it grew here because his tactical ability to completely, basically annihilate a force almost double his own size was almost never before seen, for at least not for the Persians, for sure. For an army as well trained as the Persians, it was so critical that he had things sort of that the way that he ended up winning, that the way he won was just as important as that he won. His tactical ability here was so crucial, and so the fact that he was he was able to win this battle in the way that he won it was proof that he was a masterful tactician, and there was this sort of aura of invincibility around him now. This, we will not be defeated, we cannot be defeated, and we will win. This complete morale boost for his troops, and the crushing defeat again for the Persians. Like I mentioned last week at the Battle of Issus, this is only the second time, Issus being the first, where the Persians have lost a battle where their king has been present, and now it's 2 in a row where their king is present, they've lost. And it's such a big deal now. It's crucial that, and they've lost crucial parts of their empire. Most of the empire is now under Macedonian control, and their king is forced to flee in shame again. So again, it's extremely, damaging for the morale. Anyway, that's the Battle of Gaugamela, and again, it's extremely important for Alexander's, you know, tactics and his this reputation, and also he's able to capture a ton of Persian territory and control most of the empire. And I just want to sort of again point out how important the little things were in this battle. Alexander paid attention. When he was going through the siege at Tyre, he focused on resupplying. He took the northern route to Babylon to this battle because he knew that it would be easier for his army to resupply. He paid attention to the logistics of running a massive campaign like this, and it paid off for him, right? He took that extra few days to rest before once he'd taken the hill before the battle, keeping the Persians on edge, so they were constantly stressed out, constantly on edge, constantly awaiting combat that they didn't know when it was going to come. Everything that he did here was pure masterclass. This is Alexander's masterclass, is really the Battle of Gaugamela. It so far, at least in his campaign against the Persians, it was the single biggest masterstroke of his career up to this point. It was probably it secured territory for him that otherwise he would definitely have not been able to sustain, even if they had been able to defeat the Persians. Anyway, thank you all for listening again. And I've been your host, Andrew, and thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Navigating History podcast. Bye for now.